Hello and welcome to another European Agenda program. Our main discussion topics today is Turkey's war crimes and use of chemical weapons and isolation on Kurdish leader Mr. Abdullah Ocalan. And on our Skype connection, today we have International Trade Union Advisor and member of the Coalition Against Chemical Weapons in Kurdistan, and Bert Schouwenburg, and also Dr. Patrick Huff, lecturer in the Department of Geography in Birkbeck, University of London, today with us. Thanks for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I would like to start with dear Bert. What is your opinion on the repeated reports of the Turkey's use of chemical weapons against the Kurds, first of all?
I think the allegations have been so frequent that it's very difficult for the Turkish authorities to deny that these attacks are taking place, though they are consistent in doing so. Steve Sweeney, a colleague of mine, recently did a report and what he'd seen, his first-hand experiences of visiting the villages that have been affected by Turkish attacks. And there's been more recent attacks that have been reported by representatives of the PKK, who say that the Turks are using a variety of weapons in an attempt to dislodge them from the mountains. So I think it's very difficult for the Turkish authority to deny that these attacks are indeed continuing to take place.
Thank you. Before I speak to Pat as well, you mentioned about the report as well. So how can these reports of its use of such as weapons be verified and proven? What effective action can be taken to investigate and establish the facts?
Well, the appropriate body to investigate such allegations is the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. But for whatever reason, they seem extremely reluctant to become involved. They are clearly aware of the situation because plenty of activists have told them what is occurring, although they refuse, it seems, to accept any written communication on the subject. They tend to hide behind their statute that said it must be nation states that bring these matters to their attention. I myself personally have raised this issue with my local MP, who in turn got onto the Foreign Office, the British Foreign Office. The Foreign Office responded by saying that it should be the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons that should investigate. But then, of course, when I acted upon their advice, the OPCW immediately revert back to their previous position to say that this has to come from a nation state. And so far, the British, or indeed any other nation state, has not taken the step that would force the hand of the OPCW to mount the investigation.
Thank you, dear Bert. Another significant issue, dear Patrick, one of the members of the NATO is Turkey, which in recent years has been found to have support to ISIS gangs, as well as invaded the Kurdish region of Syria, threatened the Cyprus, and been involved in incarcerations into Kurdistan and northern Iraq as well. So recently there have been even reports of Turkey using chemical weapons against Kurdish forces and civilians in the villages as well. So what is your view of these actions? How would you going to comment about all these actions?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think, it's pretty clear at this point. It's pretty indisputable that Turkey is, acting incredibly aggressively towards Kurds across the region. I mean, we could talk about Rojava. There's been drone strikes. There's been shelling in northern Syria, Rojava, for months now, ongoing, almost on a daily basis. Attacks on Kurds, in northern Iraq, as you said, military incursions, and so on. So, I mean, again, this is even leaving aside any question of the chemical weapons, just the conventional weapon attacks are, incredibly aggressive. Clearly violating, the territories of Iraq, of northern Iraq, of Rojava, etc. So, yeah, I mean, I think that it's there to see. I mean, if anybody wants to look, this is, ultimately, I mean, the project, I think we know ultimately the project is to destroy any sort of, organized Kurdish political movements, any sort of organized Kurdish resistance, and, really even the existence of kind of Kurdish identity and culture. This is the long-term project that we've seen over and over and over.
Thank you, dear Patrick. Dear Bert, I would like to also ask that what practical influence can trade unions like yourself exert on the process in order to compel the authorities charged with the verifying such as abuses to get to work?
Well, the first thing to do, of course, is make as many trade union members and trade union activists as possible aware of what is going on. If they rely on the media in the UK, they're not going to know anything because the media just simply, with the exception of the Morning Star, the media simply does not report what is going on. So therefore, it's incumbent upon us who are active within the field to make sure that as many trade unions and their activists as possible are aware, and then try and persuade them to take action. But until they know what's happening, then of course there's very little that could be done.
Thank you, Bert. Dear Patrick, we can clearly see that the nuclear weapons have been a key part of the strategy of NATO, the American-led North Atlantic Treaty Organization, since it was created actually during the Cold War period. What do you think the purpose of NATO and its nuclear arsenal is today?
Well, from kind of a reasonable perspective, I'm not sure what the purpose is other than human destruction. Nuclear weapons are, they're in a large sense pointless because any sort of nuclear war, there's really no winning a nuclear war. So that's from a reasonable perspective. I think NATO and members of NATO would argue that it's for self-defense, for deterrence, things like that. But again, as we see, NATO is a military alliance. It was formed, by the major North Atlantic powers, originally as a counter to the Soviet Union. After the Soviet Union collapsed, it kind of had an issue of, well, okay, it's gone. What do we do now? So it took some time to kind of figure out what the new threat is that could justify, its ongoing existence. And, after 9/11 in the United States, it kind of got reinvigorated, and we're seeing it being reinvigorated now due to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and so on. But in terms of nuclear weapons, I think from any reasonable perspective, the purpose is the destruction of human life and organized human civilization.
Thank you. Dear Bert, another big issue is about the arms sales. So what are the implications there for arms sales to Turkey? And nothing that the British government has lifted its sales ban to the Turkey, while Sweden recently indicated that it may resume arms exports to Turkey. That's a big development actually, following its restrictions imposed in 2019 after Turkey's invasion of the northern Syria. How would you going to comment on that?
Well, I think the actions of the British government are reprehensible, and by renewing arms sales to Turkey, they're clearly demonstrating that they care little for the fate of the Kurds, not only in Turkey but in the wider Middle East. And it would seem that their primary concern is just to make money for arms companies. As for the Swedish position, that's more difficult to comment on, but that may well be tied up with recent developments to do with the negotiations upon whether that Ukraine could become part of NATO. But that, of course, is pure speculation on my part. And indeed, the Swedes may also be only motivated by the desire to make money for their arms companies.
Thank you for that important comment, dear Bert. Dear Pat, I would like to also ask you that if there is anything else that you would like to add on about Turkey's war crimes and use of chemical weapons?
Well, again, I mean, these are incredibly serious, allegations. We see more and more of this. I mean, I can only just echo the sentiment. It has to be taken seriously. It has to be investigated thoroughly, and if kind of fully demonstrated to the kind of court of the world, if you will, it should be pursued. Prosecutions, etc. This is, again, chemical weapons are heinous weapons that should not be used. Yeah, I mean, I think, again, this has to be taken incredibly seriously by everyone.
Thank you. Dear Bert, also, would you like to add on something that I didn't ask, anything to comment on about the Turkey's war crimes, lastly, very shortly?
Well, I know we've spoken about this in the past, but it seems very difficult for the various institutions, both in Europe and in UK. I mean, in the sense of the UK is now outside the European Union. It's very difficult to get any traction with the arguments because there are clearly other strategic issues at play. We've discussed the Faustian pact that the European Union have with Turkey, whereby the Turks house millions of refugees from conflicts in the Middle East, and Erdogan there is not slow to threaten with allowing them to cross borders. And I think that continues to play a big part in why the European Union does not want to do anything to upset Erdogan. Clearly, before the UK left the European Union, they were fully supportive on their position. So I think all we can do is keep plugging away, because within these institutions there are sympathetic MEPs, there are sympathetic MPs in Britain, and I'd say we just have to keep pushing, keep putting our point across until there's a change in attitude.
Thank you, Bert. We will talk about another significant issue, the isolation of Kurdish leader Abdullah Ocalan, on our second part of the program. So I would like to carry on with dear Patrick. Dear Pat, what are your conclusions about the treatment of Ocalan after 23 years of incarceration?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, clearly the Turkish state has, brutally violated Ocalan's human rights. They continue to do that. His continued confinement, solitary confinement is, essentially torture. I think so. There's that aspect of it, which is, again, this kind of violation of Ocalan's rights personally. But then I think the continued detention is a larger violation of Kurdish political rights. Ocalan is the recognized leader of the Kurdish freedom movement. Any sort of pathway towards peace, will, need to go through, him. His freedom is necessary. His ability to negotiate in good faith with the Turkish state for peace is, again, necessary. So in a sense, his continued confinement is torture for him, but it's also torture for the Kurdish people.
Thank you. Dear Bert, you are also part of the Peace in Kurdistan campaign. That campaign has published a report. Then you are also one of the leading names on the preparation of this report, which states that Abdullah Ocalan is held in the most extreme conditions of isolation of any political prisoners in Europe. Actually, how has that situation came about? How would you going to evaluate that?
I think we have to remember that when Ocalan was abducted by a combination of various secret services and then imprisoned, the Turks originally planned to execute him. The death penalty was still in operation in Turkey, and as I recall, this was commuted to life imprisonment because this was part of Turkey's application to join the European Union. And I think, as has just been stated, the next best thing for the Turks was to isolate Ocalan as much as possible, because he is a recognised leader of the Kurdish people. He's an inspiration to the Kurdish people, and therefore he constitutes a grave danger to Erdogan and the Turkish state, who want to really, and I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say this, they want to eradicate Kurdish culture, they want to eradicate the Kurdish language. And of course, Ocalan is a barrier to that aim. So as far as they are concerned, I would say they have absolutely no intention of releasing Ocalan, because he represents a grave danger to the intentions of Erdogan towards the Kurdish people.
Thank you, dear Bert. Dear Patrick, let's talk about a little bit more about human rights and democracy. So the main question is actually, why is the European Union, which constantly sells itself very well on human rights, democracy, and complements with the international agreements, is still silent about Mr. Öcalan's isolation, who is deprived of all human rights, and why is there still no reaction against Turkey? Do you think it's political?
Yeah, yes. I mean, clearly, I think that's at this point undeniable that it's a political, it's an act of political convenience for the EU, for the EU member states. We kind of noted, I think, earlier that within the framework of NATO and various kind of other relations that Turkey has with Europe, they're convenient. Turkey, the Turkish state serves a purpose. It's and it has over the last century, and it continues to do that, even though that purpose changes to some extent. It's in some ways a client state of Europe to some extent, and yeah, I mean, it's easy for the European powers to look the other way. To look at the situation of grave injustice towards Öcalan and the Kurdish people, and look away. I mean, I think there's no denying that it's simply an act of political convenience, and obviously a betrayal of any sort of ethical commitments that they claim to have.
Thank you, Patrick. Dear Bert, also I would like to remind that the Brussels, Belgium High Court, the Supreme Court decision about the PKK to delisting from the forbidden organizations list. So one of the important questions is for you that many MPs and MEPs, the member of European Parliaments all around the Europe, talks about that the keeping Mr. Abdullah Öcalan under isolation and keeping the PKK on the forbidden organizations list is two different faces of the same coin, basically. How would you like to evaluate these two related issues?
Well, I'd agree with that analysis, and to an extent, the Turks will justify keeping Öcalan in jail because they say he's the head of a terrorist organisation. So it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy, isn't it? And so therefore, it's in the Turks' interest to have the PKK designated as a terrorist organisation, and which then justifies their attacks on who they class as terrorists. But as we've seen, both in Turkey and in Syria and in Iraq, many innocent people who have absolutely nothing to do with the PKK are being killed and maimed because the Turkish state accuses them of being, either full members of the organisation or collaborators. So that, as we know, and the Turks have continued to put pressure on the EU and others not to remove that designation of the PKK being a terrorist organisation, because if it was removed, and the PKK, and I don't think there's any doubt the PKK has never been. There's never been any proof that the PKK has ever committed a terrorist act. It's acted in defence of its people. But it does suit the Turks to have them designated as a terrorist organisation, and they will continue to pressure everybody to maintain that status.
So is it possible to say that, dear Bert, is it possible to underline that to bring peace to the region, the key part will be to delist the PKK, to open the doors to free Öcalan? Can we say that?
I think we can, because as I said earlier, I think that the two facts are related. And Ocalan, again, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that Ocalan is one of the keys to peace in the Middle East. But there are far too many vested interests who simply do not want peace in the Middle East. And one of those, I fear, is the president of Turkey.
Dear Patrick, another issue is about the CPT. The CPT has visited the Turkey 29 times, but only 10 times to the İmralı Island since 1999. What is the impact of these visits? Is there have been any impact of these visits? Because the first thing for the CPT to do is to go and visit the İmralı, but as we can see on the numbers, the CPT is kind of hiding behind of something. So is there any impact has been developed after all these visits?
I think on the face of it, I would probably say very little. It's hard to say. I think sometimes when you have even a little bit of outside pressure, even a little bit of kind of outside scrutiny, you may see some minor adjustments, minor changes, minor improvements, say for Ocalan and others being held. But clearly, it's been decades. Clearly, any improvements have been, fairly minor. I mean, we're not seeing kind of, the mass release of prisoners or interventions, and that sort of thing. So yeah, I mean, it's difficult to say, behind the scenes, does a prisoner get a little bit less brutality after a visit, by the committee? It's, again, I don't know, how that looks on the ground, but again, from the outside, it seems, relatively minor.
Thank you, dear Patrick. Dear Bert, lastly, what role can European institutions play in the struggle to free Öcalan? Do you think European institutions and commissions have willingness to free Öcalan, to play his role, to bring peace to the region? Is there any willingness, any kind of wish to bring peace to the Middle East and free Öcalan of the European establishment?
Well, I think if we discussed the answer to that is no. On an institutional level, I think they're quite happy to see Ocalan behind bars for the reasons that we've talked about. And our only hope, and I suppose I'm repeating to an extent what I said earlier, our only hope is that there are elected representatives to these institutions that can turn them around. But unfortunately, they are very much in a minority, and I fear that there is not going to be much change in the attitude of the EU in the near future.
Thank you, dear Bert. Also, I would like to ask if there is anything else you would like to add on about the isolation of Mr. Öcalan and keeping the PKK on the forbidden organizations list. Anything that I didn't ask, anything you would like to add on?
No, I think we covered the topic quite well, and it's frankly depressing that we're still having to talk about this. because if we're honest, there has been little or no progress. There are elections in Turkey next year. Possibly that may bring some slight change, but I don't know. It's difficult to be optimistic. All I can say is that I know there are many trade unionists, and indeed there are many politicians and other people who will continue to fight for the cause of the Kurdish people, and of course, freedom for Ocalan comes top of that list.
Thank you, dear Bert. Dear Patrick, is there anything else that I didn't ask you would like to add on about the isolation of Mr. Abdullah Ocalan and keeping the PKK on the forbidden organizations list?
No, I mean, I think again, I think we've more or less agree. Freedom for Ocalan is crucial, and removal of the PKK from the terrorist list is absolutely crucial and necessary to move forward with any sort of serious peace process. I would say, I guess one thing I would say is that where I think the Kurdish freedom movement has been incredibly successful is one, organizing amongst the Kurdish populations, across the four nations, and increasingly organizing with coalitions of trade unions, but also coalitions of other social movements, other groups of activists in Europe and North America, and I think that's I can only encourage more of that. I think building these coalitions, building the solidarity amongst peoples and movements is crucial. And again, the Kurdish freedom movement has been really inspiring and incredibly good at doing that. So more of that, and freedom for Ocalan.
Thank you, dear Patrick. International Trade Union Advisor and member of the Coalition Against Chemical Weapons in Kurdistan, dear Bert Schouwenburg, and Dr. Patrick Huff, lecturer in Department of Geography in Birkbeck, University of London. Thanks for joining us. Thank you for your valuable comments today.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Erem.
Thank you. Today, in our European Agenda program, we had Dr. Patrick Huff and the trade unionist Bert Schouwenburg. We will see you on the next program.